Hello, and welcome back to Bigfoot Bytes. I have a very special guest with me today. Please welcome Scott from the Bigfoot Mapping Project.
Hi, everybody. Happy to be here. It's a pleasure to be here with Chanel and talk Bigfoot. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation to see where it goes.
Yes, me too. It's almost been like 2 years in the making now, so I'm super glad. I'm honored to have you on this episode because your app has really helped me out a lot in the field. In fact, I use your app probably the most. Your app, I would say, is the number one piece of equipment I use when I'm doing Bigfoot research, so I'm very honored to have you on today.
Thank you. Thank you. I always love to hear when the app is used in the field because that's really one of the primary objectives of creating this is to be able to track real-time reports and crowdsource information and provide that as a resource for other researchers. So it's really, really great to hear that. It makes me happy to know that it's being used out in the field.
Awesome. I love that. Well, it's a symbiotic relationship. It's very good. So just to start off, for those who don't know about your app, can you just share a little bit about it? And maybe just tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what sparked your interest in Bigfoot research in general.
Sure. So I'll start with my background. It's a long-winded story, and I'll do my best to be brief, but my degree is in something called GIS, which is Geographic Information Systems. And what that is spatial analytics and spatial statistics. And I like to call it, I'm stealing a slogan here, I think from Esri, but they describe it well, and they say the science of where. Right, so GIS, you probably use it every day. If you order DoorDash, or if you hail an Uber, or if you use Google Maps for directions, that's all GIS. So even emergency management, so like 911, forestry, defense, it covers a wide breadth of industries and uses. So that's my degree. I got it from SUNY Cortland in central New York near Syracuse. Shout out to the Red Dragons. So I wouldn't be talking about GIS or Bigfoot if it wasn't for a professor named Dr. Dave Miller.
Okay.
He really inspired my creativity and inspired me not to be quote unquote defeated by the machine. So it was a great course that expanded the way that I looked at the world really through GIS. And with that degree, I jumped into the field of seismic exploration or geophysical exploration, which is essentially exploring for oil and gas by imaging what's beneath the surface of the earth. And from there, while I was out in the field, I would talk to all kinds of people. And I think this gets a little bit into the inspiration of the Bigfoot Mapping Project too, what really got me thinking about it. And it was all the conversations that I had with people about strange things that were going on all over the country. From West Virginia, where I first worked near Charleston on the Kanawha River, all the way to Oklahoma and Texas and Natchitoches, Louisiana, and DeSoto Parish and Mansfield, Louisiana, all through the northern part of the boot there. And then, like I said, Pennsylvania, and just all over the U.S. I got these stories.
Wow.
So I decided, based on my mapping background and what I was hearing, that I thought it would be a good idea to catalog these and capture them in a crowdsourced app. And so that's where, I guess, fast forward, and that brings us to today, which I think the second part of that question was if I could tell you about the Bigfoot Mapping Project itself, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. So I'll jump into that. And with that background, like I said, the Bigfoot Mapping Project was kind of always a seed in the back of my mind that I knew I could build. I just didn't have the time with work and being just traveling, and I worked 7 days a week when I was in the field. It was crazy. So I just couldn't carve out enough time to learn and build exactly what I wanted to build. Mm-hmm. But I always had a vision. So when quarantine came around, I had a lot of cabin fever. So after I exhausted all the projects around the house, I finally sat down to build the website for the Bigfoot Mapping Project and the mobile app. And what the Bigfoot Mapping Project is, the main premise of it is simple. It is approaching, cataloging, and documenting Bigfoot reports via crowdsourcing. So my thought is that I will look at eventually the data set when it's large enough through the lens of data science, big data, in addition to GIS, right? So I do analyze the data now that comes in, but eventually I'd like to have enough data points where we can train AI or ML on it and then get some answers and do some predictions and things like that for in the realm of big data analysis. So with the crowdsourcing goes, like I said, GIS, you'll hear that as a theme. Maps are one of my favorite things. I think they tell a lot and they can communicate a lot in universally, really, if they're well done. So in addition to the big data analysis that I believe will provide a lot of insights, the secondary product of the Bigfoot Mapping Project is educating people about what GIS can do, what it is, and also showing insights into the data that we get through GIS methods and analysis and producing maps.
That is just fantastic, Scott. I really admire this because for such a long time, Bigfoot had this stigma of people just kind of whacking sticks against the trees out in the woods. So the fact that you're really doing this comprehensive study and data analysis is just fantastic for the research community, which, we are halted a lot, and a lot of it is, privately funded, which is very difficult. So I really admire what you're doing. I'm so curious, and it's always the big question, and have to ask it. Have you personally ever had a Bigfoot encounter out there with any of your experiences out in the woods?
Short answer, yes.
Cool.
Two. One, I'm not sure. It was years ago. I'm almost 40 now, so this would have been way longer than I'd like to admit back in time, but I was about 14, and I grew up in I guess I'll say upstate New York, even though it's really not upstate. It's the Hudson Valley. And I was hiking with a friend of mine on top of Mount Beacon, and we rounded the backside of a reservoir, and over a knoll, like a ridge, on the backside of the ridge, there was a tree that just started shaking violently all the way to the canopy. And then this guttural, crazy roar just came out of nowhere. And it just was kind of it penetrated you all the way to the bone, right? And I was young. I was a teenager. This was probably one of our first adventures away from home, into the wilderness. And we were already nervous. So we just bolted down the mountain, and that was that. We didn't even think Bigfoot. We were just scared, right? So looking back, it could have been Bigfoot, but it was so long ago, over 25 years ago, right? Like, so it's just like, okay.
It's really
what really happened.
It's funny because I talk about that in one of my podcast episodes. I actually dive into that, how we will dismiss it. So much time will go by, and we aren't sure because we didn't have a visual confirmation, and so we will kind of psychologically dismiss it, which I'm hearing a little bit here, but it's interesting because it is first instinct when you describe everything, when you talk about this, it just sounds like classic Bigfoot. It does. It goes through you. It terrifies you. It's quite unexplainable in the moment, and your first instinct is definitely, fight or flight, running. Definitely sounds a lot like my first encounter, so that's awesome. And what about your second? Has that happened recently?
Yes, actually, it happened a couple years ago now, believe it or not.
Oh, around same time as me then. I wonder if it was an active season.
Perhaps, yeah. I was here in Texas where I live. I live in Houston now, and I've been here quite a while, and I have a deer lease out near Sealy, Texas, which is a little west on I-10, and it's in between Eagle Lake and Sealy, Texas, kind of just about. So it's like the Katy Prairie land is what they refer to it as. And I was bow hunting that evening, and I hadn't seen anything, and I was in a tree stand, so I got down out of my tree stand and walked out, but there was enough light, just enough light for me to see where I didn't need to use like my headlamp or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And when I'm hunting, I use a red light because most animals have a harder time seeing that, or they can't see that spectrum, right? So I used the red light anyway, but this night I did not, and I was walking out, and as I was walking out, I went through the barbed wire fence, and which separated the prairie, the I guess you call it not the prairie, but the pasture where all the cows are. And then on my left is the river bottom area, kind of pass-through land where I hunt. And I was walking out, and the pasture's on my right, and the river bottom's on my left now. And I'm probably, I don't know, when I first exited the river bottom, a couple hundred yards from my truck. So I was walking, and I finally got to maybe 30 or 40 yards from my truck, so it's directly in front of me where I parked it. And then on my left, probably at my 10, 11 o'clock, there was like a sagebrush. So they're not fair. This was like waist to chest height, maybe on a person, right? Mm-hmm. So, I would say maybe a little over waist. Chest height's more accurate.
Yeah.
And when I look over there, I saw a big, dark blob right behind it, and I was thinking, all right, this is a hog. There's tons of hogs where I have tons. So I just naturally thought, oh, this is a wild, looks like a boar. It's pretty big. It's probably 300 pounds. I'm not going to mess with it. I only have my bow. It's dark.
Yeah.
So I'll just stand here and let it be on its way, and I'll kind of sneak behind it, and neither of us will be bothered. Well, I was standing there, and it stood up.
Oh.
Out of nowhere, straight up on two legs.
Oh.
And yeah, it was.
That's when you know.
Yeah, I've told this story a couple times, but it stood up, and this bush was probably right around a little lower than waist level on it. So it's tall, right? This is 7 feet minimum, right? 6.5, 7 feet minimum, pretty large individual, and it had broad shoulders, huge pointy head, virtually no neck from what I could see.
Wow.
And it was like a silhouette. It was that time of night where it was like blue gray, everything's a shadow.
Yeah.
So as it stood up and it was looking at me, I just stood there and kind of processing. And this is where I become a better witness than when I was 14, right? I pay attention. I'm not as afraid of things. I've learned a lot more. But it still got me, and all I could say was, whoa. One word, I was just like, whoa.
Just
very
shocked.
surprised.
Yeah.
Like, to myself. And when I said that, it squatted back down. And I stood there, and I was like, all right, what do I do?
Yeah, it was reactive.
So I literally said, just as if it were a person or something. I don't know what I was thinking. Right? What do you think if you think you're about to talk to a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot? What do you say, right? So I said,
right.
I literally said, I see you, just like you're talking, like you found somebody playing hide and seek, you know?
Yeah.
And then it got back up, turned around, and bolted full tilt through all the brush and into a patch of trees, and I could just hear it breaking branches as it was running.
Wow.
And you can tell the difference between a deer running if you've hunted versus something that's like a person or bipedal hitting the ground. And this was 100% a definitive, crunching and pattern. So I just stood there and I was like, what? As it then it sunk in. I was like, this thing is very, very large. It's startled. I need to get to my truck.
Could you feel it in the ground as it was running away in those few steps, as it was still kind of close to you? Could you feel it in the ground?
No, and I don't think I could because this is very loamy, sandy soil, which absorbs energy very well. And we'll get into that when we talk about seismic, actually. But
yes,
yeah, no, I could really only hear it, but that was enough.
Yeah.
It is still something that it's funny this happened after I started the Bigfoot Mapping Project, because as soon as I told people about it, I was like, great. Everyone's going to think like,
they're not going to believe you.
Sure, the Bigfoot guy
had a Bigfoot
suddenly saw a Bigfoot sighting, had a Bigfoot sighting. And it's just like, no, I really did. And I'm to the point where most people that know me know I'll shoot you straight about that kind of, like, what's going on. And I'm very skeptical, scientifically minded. But this was unexplainable. And if it wasn't a Bigfoot, I don't know what it was.
Yeah.
So can I definitively say, yes, that was Bigfoot? I mean, no. But it was, it's an 11,000 acre cattle farm that I hunt on. And I don't lease all of that. I lease a couple hundred acres of it. But
and
there's no homes. It's near a wild federal land, borders federal land. So it's just like there's nowhere for people to live within a couple miles of this area, right? So,
so it wouldn't make sense for it to be kind of like a vagabond or a really, really, really tall homeless guy who's out there living in the wilderness, right? None of it.
Oh no, you wouldn't want to be living out there. There's so many mosquitoes and spiky, spiny things, and it's dangerous. There's wild boars, and nobody would want to live out there.
And see, these things are so great because when we accumulate all of the elements within the encounter moment, we can, by process of elimination, say, yeah, it's definitely not a person because of X, Y, and Z, right? So that's why we can pretty easily say, yeah, I had a Bigfoot encounter. And I know for a lot of people, it does sound, like you said, we're already notoriously known for being these Bigfoot people, like, oh yeah, of course, now all of a sudden you're having all these Bigfoot encounters. But it does make sense because once you immerse yourself in this research and you're constantly out there, like you said, you're out thousands and thousands of acres, right? Not many people think about statistically how few people are actually constantly on a regular basis out there in the wilderness, out on properties that have thousands and thousands of acres. I mean, a lot of people do live in cities and, are not getting out into these national parks as often as we are because we're running this research or because of the area we live in or, whatever circumstances it may be. But it's interesting, though, that we kind of had that segue to talk about how you're you work with this seismic technology, because that's something that I've thought about, recently. I was reading about how researchers in other countries are trying to track herds of elephants. Sometimes they're trying to find out if their migrational patterns are, how they're doing with all of that. So they actually realized that using a seismograph to track them was a lot easier. And so I got to thinking in one of my Bigfoot encounters, and that's why I asked you if you felt it in the ground, and it was a good point you made, because with my encounter, it was great, solid, firm ground, and we were able to feel it beneath our feet. And that's kind of where the idea was born in my head, that we need to start using better technology and more accurate technology to track Sasquatch because they are so smart. And in your story is a great example of the fact that not only are they reactive, but they're obviously, despite their size, they're terrified of people. And my assumption would be because they're constantly witnessing us killing other animals around them. And so they've learned that even with a few spoken words, to get up and run from us, I mean, that's pretty powerful. So I think that based on their heightened awareness and intelligence and ability to understand, I need to flee in this moment, a time when they understand that they're not so visible at night, right? And they're intelligent. So we need to start moving forward with the types of equipment that we use. So I would like to kind of talk about that. So tell me a little bit more about your background in that and how that pertains to the mapping project itself.
Sure. So for the listeners, I'll dive into a little bit. But first, I'm going to have a disclaimer. I'm a GIS guy. I make maps. I color in the lines. That's my job. But I work with a lot of geophysicists over the years. So I've picked up just enough to be dangerous and understand what seismic data it really is in the context of looking for oil and gas. So
Gotcha. Okay. So
I don't work with wildlife or anything like that.
Gotcha.
This is like drilling wells type stuff going on.
Okay.
And
It's interesting how things can connect, though. So I'm curious to hear kind of a little bit, what you've learned along the way.
sure. So I've learned a lot. Now, one of the things I've learned is about the equipment. So you talk about sensitive equipment, and I think that's very relevant. And I'll draw the comparison that you used, tracking herds of elephants versus tracking a singular Bigfoot, for example, or even a family unit, would be a little bit easier with the equipment than looking for Bigfoot, because elephants are so much bigger and heavier, and there's many of them to produce enough energy to be picked up by these. They're called geophones, or I don't know what other sensors they'd be using for seismology, but in seismic we use something called a geophone, which is a group of magnets that are attached to a cable, or now they're nodal, and what they do is they pick up the vibrations and they convert it into electrical energy, which can then be recorded, right? So that's how they get those charts that you see, right? The seismograph, everybody can picture it, where the pointer is drawing on the paper and it's got all these wavy lines. So I think tracking Bigfoot via seismology is interesting.
You think it would have to be a more fine-tuned, and it's interesting. Okay, so that's interesting, because when I spoke to Caltech, I did reach out to Caltech, and she was very, very intrigued by this, and she did tell me she'd reach back out to me, so I'm eager to hear what she has to say. But she did tell me there was a professor that worked at Caltech who now is working over, I believe, for Harvard. And I believe that he has fine-tuned this machine, and what I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I believe he was using fiber optic cables of sorts, and he was, gosh, I wish I could remember what it was, but it was something on a smaller scale. It was basically taking the technology, bringing it to a smaller scale, and it was also having to do with noise pollution. So it's interesting when you say that they transmute the data and turn it into, these frequencies, so to speak, because a lot of this seismic activity that was on such a smaller scale that didn't register as an earthquake, right? It was kind of an anomaly. They thought, well, this is coming from something else. Well, it turns out it was noise pollution. So that
like
was
highways and trains and all kinds of things like that. Yeah.
And so I thought to myself, here's an interesting concept, right? If this type of technology is able to pick up, like you just described, things like that, well, let's think about a Sasquatch screaming at the top of their lungs and their lung capacity and their body cavity size. Wouldn't it be fantastic if not only we could register, motion and movement, like you said, even if it's a family unit all migrating, but what if we could also register their vocal, get some vocal analysis, some real deal vocal analysis. I sure wish that my recording wasn't next to a river, but I'll just have to keep going with that. So that's very interesting. You and I will have to talk kind of on the sidelines, and if you have, or if any of the listeners here have anyone or know anybody that works in this type of technology or has any forward-thinking ideas that we could use here, we really have to work together and network. So this is great that we're chatting about this.
I'm certainly obviously all for innovation.
Yeah.
And I think you're onto something. I just don't know enough about the instrumentation or the sensors that would need to be used for that type of application. Because what I work on is the projects I'm on are thousands of square miles, right? And or hundreds of square miles. And we're using something called fiber-sized trucks, which are 30 tons, that put that much energy into the ground. So, I mean, that's a huge difference compared to tracking an organism that is only physically able to produce so much energy to be picked up.
Right.
But but I can say one thing, which makes me think that it's viable. It would just have to be planned well or planned out so that you could pick it up. But when we were in Pennsylvania, especially, and we were using cables with geophones, you could actually see rabbits hopping next to the geophones. If they were close to them. You could see them the energy they put into the ground.
Wow.
But
it was
they
super
had
close,
to be
huh?
very close, virtually on top of the geophone. So I know it's possible, but it would have to be extremely sensitive.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I'll touch on is, you said it yourself, it's called noise pollution, but that's also something that's got an application in the data. You call it noise, right? So it's stuff you're picking up that and energy and frequencies that you don't want in the data that can be introduced from, just like you said, highways, trains,
rivers,
all kinds of things like that. So you have to filter that out, and that's how they process the data. They identify that, and they use all kinds of geophysics to do that, and that's where it really gets over my head. So that's about as far as I can be considered, not even an expert level, knowledgeable at least, maybe, about that.
Well, that brings me into my next question then. What challenges have you faced? What challenges have you faced in, not only developing but maintaining the Bigfoot Mapping Project?
Some of the challenges we faced are like researchers in general are very protective of their data sets. So I've asked various researchers to participate by joining the map and adding their sightings. And I think they're busy. They get into, it's like extra work for them. I have offered to help them get their data basically standardized and formatted to fit into the map. And I think what I'm alluding to by saying, I want more data from researchers, but I understand their concerns is people are concerned by publishing this data that people are going to go out and hunt Bigfoot, and it's going to have a negative impact on the species itself. Mm-hmm. So I'd say that's the biggest challenge, is people being concerned about the welfare of Bigfoot itself as a species, and God forbid it was discovered by somebody that had not the best intentions. Mm-hmm. So it's a challenge, right? Because that's why a lot of people hold back. And if you go to the website, I don't hide anything that's been submitted. So,
well, that's great.
I think I could see why people would worry about that. So I think it's their concern is the biggest challenge for gathering data.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense on both ends of the coin, because on one hand, we have a lot of gatekeeping, which makes sense because we're all, we're trying to preserve this beautiful, incredible species, right? And we're trying to make sure that they're protected and left alone. And so that makes sense. But on the other hand, I'm with you. I think the data really needs to be in there. And actually, personally, I'm pretty sure I only have one of my encounters in there. So you've just motivated me to make sure I put the other two in there and make sure that they're updated and that I have as much information as possible. Because, people think that these are just stories, that they're just Bigfoot stories, right? They're not. They're actually accounts, and that goes into behavior analysis. So not only do we need to have the research being about, tracking and, fine-tuning all of these small pieces of evidence, but it's also about the story, because the story, as long as it's not always changing and being elaborated upon and sensationalized, right? As long as the story stays the same and it's accurate and it's to the best account possible, and even it's best if you document it so that it just plain doesn't change. It's just so important for behavioral analysis, because I've been doing that quite a lot lately, because as a vocalist myself, in order to start truly analyzing the language of Sasquatch and, in my hopes, redefine how we even express or put into the dictionary what the definition of language is, it's just so wrong, in my opinion. So in order to really analyze how they're communicating, what they're saying to each other, what they're saying to us when they actively choose. And a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that we're going up and like poking Bigfoot in the back and making him mad and he's yelling at us. No, they're actively choosing to come up to us and communicate with us. So vital for us to start to analyze what it is they're saying, what it is they're expressing, and start to develop a language analysis, if you will, and also that goes in tandem with their behaviors, right? So people think that these are just stories, but they're really important pieces of data. So you've definitely inspired me to make sure I've got the other two in there. So I'll make sure and do that.
Well, you actually touched on a great point there,
Yeah.
and I think to use your words, people think they're just stories, but when you can standardize the data set and capture attributes from these reports, you can then start to build patterns and make predictions and see trends and add context, start to see hotspots, start to do different analysis that maybe if you weren't looking at it that way, you would only think they're stories because you only hear them every so often and you don't see them in context. You don't see them next to each other. You don't see them symbolized by different attributes on the map or even run through. I did an analysis of maybe last year where I ran my entire database through an AI model and pulled out some insights that I never would have thought. Basically, like what are the most common words used? What are these questions that I asked? And I'll have to share it with you. It was pretty interesting, the insights that came out as far as like the most active times.
Yeah.
It was kind of counterintuitive for me. Like there were way more daytime sightings than nighttime sightings, and I would have thought the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, the nighttime encounters are certainly far more visceral and impactful, I think, in terms of telling the story and the feeling, the sensation, and the experience, because it's just really terrifying already, the unknown of the nighttime and what's out there, right? But yeah,
Right.
so yeah, it falls to the wayside that people forget that they're not nocturnal. They are not. They're out all day, and yeah, absolutely, people see them crossing roads and picking bugs out of trees and all kinds of things like that. So that's really interesting.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
so I'm really curious, on a positive side, what's been the most rewarding aspect of your journey so far in this Bigfoot research, do you think?
There's a couple, actually. The first one, I'd be remiss if I didn't say it, is the community. There, in particular, are a few people, including Amy Boo, Doug Hychek, Renee Holland, a bunch of people that have been, Emily, I mentioned her earlier, Forrest Fleur, Alex Petticop, all of those new friends that I've been able to make, yourself included. And it's just such a surprise that now looking back, I didn't think that I would make all these friends doing this. I thought it was going to be a pretty dry experiment on data. But
Yeah.
there are so many people in the community that are interested in explaining the mystery of Bigfoot and learning from each other. And I really think that's the biggest reward for putting pen to paper and building the website and the mobile app, because I truly never thought that it would turn out like it has. So I'm very grateful to have all of those new friends and research affiliates and people I've met and people I've learned things from. Very, very grateful for that. So that's definitely number one. And number two, the biggest reward is getting to make all these maps and share them with people, because as much as I'm passionate about Bigfoot, I'm also very passionate about GIS and what it can do. And I've hopefully opened some people's eyes to how much it can really tell you about the world around you and inspired people to get out. That's the second biggest reward for sure. Very, very people-oriented rewards. I hope the third one is that we find Bigfoot. But
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Those are beautiful answers. Really great answers. I just I couldn't agree more. I think I was really shocked because I thought at first, when I was like, okay, I'm going to tell everybody that I'm pretty sure I had a Bigfoot encounter, and I thought for sure everyone would chastise me and ostracize me and tell me I was crazy and, I don't know, block me and think I was, throw me in the loony bin. But I haven't ever met so many accepting and just kind people. And you're right, like genuinely curious people who are not interested in, throwing out harsh opinions, but they're more interested in asking questions. And I love that, because when we ask questions and we interact and communicate with each other, it just helps this research so much more, because there's a lot of frustration with it. There's a lot of times where you have a lot of stagnant time where it's been 2 years now since I've had a Bigfoot encounter, and it's really hard, because you start to feel like, for me as a researcher, I start to feel like a little bit of a failure, but these people reach out to me and are so supportive and wonderful, and also when I want to give up, I've uncovered a lot of really heavy, intense things through these Freedom of Information Act requests, and a lot of it's very heavy, and I feel I'm carrying this weight a lot, and a lot of these people, I couldn't agree more. They're just good people that we all kind of want to work together on this and make this discovery together and have it move forward together, and that's exciting, because I think when there's this aspect of competition of who's going to get the best footage first, or who's going to break the story first, or who's going to have the best spooky video first, that's what divides everybody. And a little bit of that gatekeeping is kind of part of that too. But I find that once we kind of break people's walls down a little bit and say, hey, look, we're all in this together, and if so-and-so gets the first crystal clear footage, we will celebrate all together as a community, because that helps us all with the research. The more
Absolutely.
the more pieces of incredible evidence we get, we have to celebrate this all together. So, your work is just fantastic. I really love what you do, and that was a fantastic answer. So I'm just going to kind of wrap this up a bit here. And one thing I also wanted to ask, so, any listeners who are, researchers themselves, if you could give one piece of advice to any aspiring Bigfoot researchers, what do you think that would be?
Well, I'm going to summarize a lot of pieces of advice that I've learned and asked for from people I consider experts, because although I am a mapper and definitely an avid outdoorsman, I wouldn't say that I am a teacher. I learn by doing. So, and I learn by talking to people. So I try to absorb as much as I can and be humble. So the piece of advice that I would start with would be listen to people who are trying to help. Even though I struggle with this, right? I have my own ideas, and oftentimes I can't help but focus on how I don't agree with their idea necessarily, or my idea is taking me a different way. But there's always an insight in these people that have put thought and work, and they've put a lot of effort into their research. And the more you listen, and this is advice I got years ago when I was working in the field, the more you listen, the more you learn. Even if you're listening to something that you think is totally wrong, there's always something to learn. So that's one thing about research that I think stays along the lines of community, and it's being respectful and listening to other people. That's a challenge, especially when you have your own ideas that you're very passionate about, myself included. The second thing is when you putting it into practice, right? So when you're actually out doing research, and this is where my outdoors side comes in, is safety and knowledge, and understanding the risks of going into remote places and doing this research, because there's not just Bigfoot out there, right? There's risks, there's rough terrain, there's weather, there's wildfires, there's predators, mountain lions, bears, there's poisonous plants. You can run into a bad situation where you get hurt or you need first aid. So you always need to have a plan. You need to understand how, to bring enough water, first aid kit, bring a paper map, let people know where you're going to be researching, all of the above. So those are two things. One is more community learning related, and being humble and respectful and listening, and not just waiting to talk,
Absolutely.
And then the second is just really, really educate yourself as much as you can about where your research area is, and about wilderness safety. Because I would hate, and this comes from an area of concern for me, especially because I put maps out there. I would hate for somebody to plan a research trip or expedition based on one of my maps that leads you to a remote area and you not be prepared and something, God forbid, happens, I would feel responsible. So if I really want to say, please, 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 if you plan on going out and doing these remote expeditions and being in the wilderness for a period of days or even one day or just a short hike, just be prepared, because you never know what can happen. So that's a piece of advice that I would probably say shout from the rooftops if I could.
So that's just a fantastic point. Safety first, that's really, really great advice. I myself have been, tempted to just go out there and let's pack a bag and go for a Bigfoot run, but I have to check myself because you are dealing with treacherous terrain and very, very dangerous, life-threatening situations. And, I lived in Lake Tahoe for a really long time, and we have these people every year who come and think it's just a huge playground, and they forget that we have massive predators, apex predators, and we also have, very unforgiving terrain, and especially in the winter, and like you said, storms can roll in and things. So really, really, really great advice. I think I could take your advice on number one, though. I could learn to humble myself. I just get so excited when you get a piece of evidence. You just want to shout it from the rooftop.
It's hard not to.
You have to stay humble.
I mean, that's why I say it, because, oftentimes I really should just follow my own advice. And I mean, that's coming from personal experience. That is me. That is something I repeat to myself when I'm talking to people. Listen. In my head, I'm just listen to this person, because they have very good information and you want to learn from them. And I struggle with that because I love to talk. So
it's good to contribute. Well, this has been a joy talking with you, but we're going to wrap things up here, and I just want to thank you so much for all of this information. That's been my main goal, is to bring a lot of factual evidence and information and comprehensive studies to this research, although it can be a lot of fun and it can be very wild and, off the grid wild behavior and just craziness, but for the most part, I'm really glad that we can keep ourselves tethered and have this grounded approach to everything. So I really, really appreciate what you do. And I want to let everybody know where they can find more information about the Bigfoot Mapping Project and just kind of keep up with your latest updates and everything, and just check out your work.
Sure. If I'm able to plug away at a few things, is that all right?
Absolutely. Plug away. I want people to know what you're doing, because it's really going to push this research forward. And you are my first official podcast guest, so I really want you to...
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and I wanted you to feel like you could plug away anything that you're doing, because like you said, people can contribute to it. They can reach out with their encounters, and it can only help by networking. So please, plug away.
Sure. Okay. So if you or somebody you know have had a Bigfoot sighting, report, encounter, etc., the first thing that you should do is go to bigfootmap.com and fill out the Submit a Sighting form. And that has a series of standardized questions, not too many, where you can document your report and put it in the map. This can be from any time. It doesn't have to be recent. It could be from your childhood. It could be, if you got grandparents that have had this, you help them fill out the form and get it documented. Anytime. The most important thing is to get this information into the database. So that's bigfootmap.com, and that is where you can also click around on the map and look at the hotspot. I have two maps. There's the new map and the classic map. And the new map has all kinds of filters and tools, elevation profile tools. You can see hotspots in the map. You can click and read about all the sightings. I just added all kinds of new data into the map from the what's the name of the nature database that I just referenced? But there's all kinds of other species sightings with photos now that you can access. I just added data from iNaturalist, which is also a crowdsourced database, but it's for all wildlife and vegetation across the globe. And I did an analysis on common hackberry hotspots, for example, which is an insight from a guest that I had on my podcast, Mapping Bigfoot, which is on YouTube on the Untold Radio channel that Doug Highcheck produces. So there's only 3 episodes out there, so I'm fledgling at the podcast recording, being a host. But they're great episodes. The first episode is just me introducing the idea and talking about my background and the podcast itself. And the second is Amy Boo. She's a great guest. She talks about Project Zoo Book. And the third is Dr. Meriwether Vorderbruggen. And he is he holds 16 patents. He's a genius. He teaches how to forage wild foods and edible plants and wild medicine. So we had a 2-hour episode just recently. It was amazing. I learned so much. And then finally, if you really want to see maps and stuff that I personally make and put out there, just follow Bigfoot Mapping Project on Instagram, and you can just explore a little bit about how my mind works and how I'm looking at the data. And then please let me know what you think. If you want to reach out, it's scott@bigfootmap.com, and I will always do my best to reply, answer questions, help with data, whatever you need when it comes to Bigfoot.
That is fantastic. I love all of that. And, I just appreciate it so much. It's helped me to not be just spinning a globe and sticking my finger on the globe and then driving in the middle of nowhere. You've really helped me a lot to stay
I'm glad to
focused.
hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Scott, thank you so much for talking to me about all of this. And I certainly look forward to listening to your podcast myself. I'm excited to go visit that on YouTube. And everyone who's listening, please check Scott's work out. And thank you so much for taking a big, juicy bite with me today on Bigfoot Bytes. And I will talk to you all very soon.